The night was unforgiving. The storm had unleashed its fury with torrential rain hammering the windshield, blurring the line between the road and the world beyond it. Detective Marshall Race squinted through the downpour, his old Ford truck's wipers struggling against the relentless rain. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, but he wasn't unfamiliar with these rural roads. The quiet town of Verdon Falls was barely an hour's drive from the city, but it felt a lifetime away. Here, things were simple, predictable. Or so he thought. Reese adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his tired eyes half-lidded from the weight of a long shift. But as he rounded a bend in the road, something caught his attention. A figure. A movement in the distance, barely visible against the wet, slick tarmac. His instincts, honed over years of service, flared to life. He hit the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as he pulled to a stop. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what it was. A colt. A young horse, standing motionless in the middle of the road, its coat stained with blood. Its body shook uncontrollably, the legs beneath it trembling as it struggled to stay upright. The colt's eyes were wide with fear, a frantic glimmer that spoke of pain, of trauma. There was no mistaking it. The animal had been through hell. Reese didn't hesitate. He leaped from the truck, his boots hitting the wet pavement with a solid thud. The rain lashed at his face, but he ignored it, his eyes locked on the creature that seemed as lost and broken as he felt. He moved cautiously toward the colt, his steps measured, every part of him alert to the danger the animal might pose. Just as he reached the colt, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the eerie stillness of the night. A black SUV appeared from the fog, its headlights cutting through the rain like a blade. It stopped beside Reese's truck, its engine rumbling as the rain bounced off the hood. The man who stepped out of the SUV was tall, his figure cloaked in a dark suit despite the weather. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, his expression unreadable. But it was the tone of his voice that made Reese's stomach tighten. "That horse belongs to me," the man said, his voice cold and smooth, like ice. There was no question in his words, no plea, only a demand. Reese looked up from the colt, his eyes narrowing. "This horse is in bad shape. It needs help." His fingers brushed the colt's coat, feeling the heat from the burns, the blood slick on its fur. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a passerby. He was someone who knew the colt, and whatever had happened to it, it wasn't an accident. The man in the suit took a step forward, his boots crunching on the wet ground. "I don't care what it needs," he said, his gaze sharp. "That colt is mine. And I'll take him back now." Reese's mind raced. There was something wrong here. No one with any decency would let an animal suffer like this, especially not in the middle of nowhere. In the dead of night, he glanced at the colt once more, its breathing shallow, its body shaking violently. The rain was washing away the blood, but not the evidence, not the truth. Reese stepped in front of the animal, his eyes never leaving the man. "I'm not giving him to you." The man's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. The tension in the air became thick, palpable. For a moment, Reese could feel the weight of the man's gaze, like a physical force pushing him back. But he stood his ground. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man said, his voice lowering. "This is bigger than you. And if you don't give me that colt, you'll regret it." Reese's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his side, but before he could even make a move, the man held up a hand, signaling for calm. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, though the words felt empty. I just need the colt. It's not your problem." But it already was Reese's problem. It was more than just a horse in trouble. There was a story behind this animal, and it wasn't a pretty one. Reese could feel it in his gut, the same gut feeling that had kept him alive for years in this line of work. Something was off. And it wasn't just the storm. The man in the suit didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, heading back to the SUV. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced back at Reese, a knowing smile curling at the corner of his lips. "You'll wish you hadn't gotten involved," he called out before slamming the door shut. The SUV roared to life, disappearing into the night, leaving Reese standing alone with the Colt, his heart racing, his mind reeling. As the rain continued to pour down, Reese stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. The Colt was still trembling, its eyes wide with terror. Reese didn't know who the man was or what he wanted with the horse, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And Reese, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, was going to find out exactly what that was. With one final glance down the road where the SUV had vanished, Reese made his decision. He would help the Colt, and he would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The early morning hours were just beginning to break through the heavy, rain-filled clouds, casting a faint gray light over the landscape. Marshall Reese was on his way home, but his thoughts were far from the quiet comforts of his small house at the edge of Verdon Falls. His mind raced, replaying the events from the night before. Everything from the Colt in the road to the strange man in the black SUV. It didn't sit right with him, not one bit. He pulled into the long driveway of his modest home, the engine of his truck rattling as it came to a stop. The rain had finally slowed to a soft drizzle, but the damage had already been done. His clothes clung to his body, his hair plastered to his forehead. He wiped his face with his sleeve, his eyes scanning the quiet, empty stretch of land that surrounded his home. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, or so it seemed. But that was before the Colt. Reese killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, feeling the cool, damp air settle over him. The house, though small, was his sanctuary, his retreat from the world, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. The only sounds were the distant chirps of birds in the trees and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost serene, but peace was something he hadn't felt in a long time, not since she died. He ran his hand over his face, trying to shake off the memories. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident. It had been a rainy night, just like this one, and she hadn't seen the truck coming around the bend. Reese had tried everything he could to save her, but there was no changing what had happened. The loss still haunted him, gnawing at his insides like a slow poison. He hadn't been the same since. He kept to himself, focusing on his work, shutting out anything that might make him feel. But that all changed when the Colt appeared in the middle of the road. And now, that same pull, that same need to protect something helpless, was surging through him once again. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that Colt wasn't just a victim of circumstance. There was something more to this, and he couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, Reese walked into the small barn attached to his house. He'd already put the Colt inside, setting up a bed of hay for it to rest on. The young horse had barely moved since Reese had found it on the road, but it was still alive, still breathing, even if it was barely clinging to consciousness. Reese had seen his fair share of injuries over the years, both human and animal, but this Colt had a different kind of wound, something deeper, something darker. The barn smelled like wet hay and wood, the scent of the place grounding him as he approached the Colt. He crouched down beside the animal, examining the damage more closely. The Colt's coat was matted with blood, and the burn marks were severe, too precise to be an accident. Reese knew this wasn't some random act of cruelty. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. "Hey there," he murmured softly, reaching out to touch the Colt's trembling body. It flinched, but Reese didn't pull away. He wasn't afraid of it. It was just scared, like he was. "You're not alone. I'll help you." He sat there for a long time, watching the Colt's breathing slow, listening to the occasional drip of water from the ceiling, the silence in the barn growing heavier by the minute. But his thoughts kept wandering back to the man in the suit. There was something about him that Reese couldn't shake. The coldness in his voice, the way he had looked at him as though he were nothing more than a nuisance. Reese had dealt with enough people in his life to know when someone was hiding something. And that man was hiding something. Marshall Reese wasn't the kind of person who got involved in things that didn't concern him. He had learned the hard way to stay out of other people's business. It was one of the reasons he had become a homicide detective in the first place. Life was messy, people were messy, and it was easier to keep a distance. But the Colt? It felt like the storm was already here, and no matter how hard he tried to steer clear of it, he was going to get swept up in it. Reese stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and made his way to the small desk in the corner of the barn. There, under a stack of paperwork, was his phone. He hadn't looked at it since the night before, not wanting to get distracted, but now it seemed like the right time. He needed to know more about the Colt, about the man in the black SUV, and about what had really happened at Ashwick Hollow. The phone was still damp from the rain, but Reese wiped it off and unlocked it. He opened his contacts, scrolling through until he found the name he was looking for. Dr. Aria Lenz. She was a vet he'd known for years, an old friend who had always been a source of knowledge in the world of animals. Reese wasn't an expert in animal injuries, but he knew Aria had seen it all. If anyone could help him make sense of what was going on, it was her. He pressed the call button and waited as the phone rang. After a few moments, her voice came through the speaker, groggy but alert. "Marshall? What's going on?" "I need you to look at something," he said, his voice low. "A Colt. Found it last night on the road. It's bad, Aria. If real bad." She was quiet for a moment, her voice dropping in volume. "I'll be there in an hour. Just be careful, okay?" "I will. And thanks, Aria." Reese hung up and looked back at the Colt. The storm outside had passed, but there was a new kind of storm brewing, one that he was about to get caught up in whether he liked it or not, and no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, this was just the beginning. The barn was quiet as Marshall Reese sat next to the Colt, the sound of its shallow breathing the only noise in the air. The early morning light filtered weakly through the cracks in the barn's wooden walls, casting long shadows on the hay-strewn floor. The Colt had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, but Reese wasn't able to rest. His thoughts were still tangled up in the events of the previous night, the strange encounter with the man in the black SUV, the Colt's bloodied body, and the unsettling feeling that the whole thing was connected to something much bigger than a simple case of animal cruelty. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The sound of an approaching truck broke the silence, the engine's low rumble growing louder as it neared the barn. Reese stood up, brushing the hay from his jeans, and made his way to the door just as Dr. Aria Lenz pulled up in her old pickup truck. She was an experienced veterinarian, and though they hadn't seen much of each other in recent years, Reese knew he could count on her. Aria had always been straightforward, no nonsense, and damn good at her job. She climbed out of the truck and greeted him with a nod, her short brown hair wet from the rain. She was wearing a weathered leather jacket and old boots, the kind of outfit that told you she was no stranger to the muck and grime of working with animals. "You called for a hero?" Aria asked with a smirk, though her eyes quickly fell to the Colt lying on the ground. The expression on her face shifted from playful to serious. "What the hell happened to it?" Reese didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I found him last night. He was in the middle of the road, bloodied, burned, and barely standing. Someone did this to him." Aria knelt beside the Colt, running her hands over its body with practiced care. She didn't say anything at first, her fingers probing the burns along its side, the deep wounds that had been deliberately inflicted. After a moment, she looked up at Reese, her face grim. "This wasn't some random accident," she said quietly. "These injuries, they weren't just from the fire. They were intentional." She paused, her gaze lingering on the Colt's trembling form. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. And I have a feeling it's more than just a case of animal abuse. Aunt Reese leaned against the wall of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest. "I thought so too, but there's something more to this. I've been digging into it since last night. That man, the one who showed up at the scene, he didn't act Like he cared about the horse? He was just cold, demanding. And he didn't hesitate to tell me the colt belonged to him. Arya's brow furrowed. Who is he? I don't know, Reese replied, frustration creeping into his voice. But I'm going to find out. I can feel it, Arya. This is more than just a stray horse on the side of the road. There's something bigger at play here, something shady, and I'm not going to let it slide. Arya stood up and brushed her hands off, clearly thinking. I've seen injuries like this before. Not often, but I've seen them. They're precise, like someone knew exactly where to burn, where to mark. And I think I know where this colt came from. Reese's ears perked up. What are you talking about? Oh, she hesitated for a moment, her eyes drifting to the colt. It's the brand. The one on its flank. She reached down and gently pulled away the colt's fur, revealing a small, almost faint brand burned into its side. Reese had missed it before, but now that Arya pointed it out, he could see the faint markings, scorched letters that had been partially erased by the fire. Arya looked at Reese, her expression serious. That brand, it's from Ashwick Hollow. I know it because I've seen it on other horses before, high-end thoroughbreds that were once part of a breeding program there. Reese's blood ran cold. Ashwick Hollow. He had heard the name before, years ago. The estate had once been a luxurious ranch, known for breeding champion racehorses, but that was before the scandal. Rumors had swirled about abuse, mistreatment, and a string of missing foals, but the case had never been fully investigated. The place had been shut down, its operations dismantled. But the whispers lingered, and the truth had never fully come to light. Are you sure? Reese asked, his voice low. That brand was burned off. How do we know it's from Ashwick? Arya didn't answer immediately. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small magnifying glass, holding it up to the colt's side. Look closely, she said, pointing to the edges of the brand. There's a faint outline of the old logo, a stylized A with a hollow inside it. It's subtle, but it's there. Reese's mind raced. Ashwick Hollow wasn't just a local scandal. It had been a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the horse racing industry. The abuse, the cover-ups, the missing horses. And now here was this colt, tied to it in some way. Reese could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders. He ran a hand through his hair. This colt might be the key to everything, he muttered. If it's from Ashwick, then someone is trying to cover up the truth, and they're willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it hidden. Arya sighed, her eyes dark with concern. I don't like this, Marshal. I've seen the people who run Ashwick, billionaires, businessmen who don't care about anything except profit. If this colt really is from Ashwick, there's no telling what kind of trouble you're walking into. Reese's jaw clenched. I've been in trouble before. This is different. I'm not going to back down now. I can quick look. Arya gave him a long look, then nodded. Just be careful. I'll help you however I can, but I'm not getting involved with them. I've seen what they're capable of. Reese nodded, grateful for her help, but he knew she was right. Ashwick Hollow was a hornet's nest, and if he poked it, there was no telling what would come out. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away now, not when the truth was staring him in the face. As Arya left the barn, Reese stood alone with the colt, its fragile form resting in the hay. The rain had stopped, but the storm was far from over. The following morning, after Dr. Arya Lenz had left, Marshal Reese couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. The colt's injuries were more than just physical. They were symbolic, tied to something much darker, something hidden beneath the surface of a quiet, rural town that had long forgotten its past. Reese could feel the pull, that gut instinct telling him to follow this thread wherever it led, and somewhere deep inside, he knew it would lead him to Ashwick Hollow. He spent the next several hours on the phone, making calls, digging through old records, and visiting the county archives. He found himself retracing the steps of a case that had gone cold, something that no one had wanted to revisit. The more he dug, the more he unearthed. A history of abuse, lies, and cover-ups. But the one thing that stuck with him the most was a name: Sterling Callahan. Callahan was the billionaire who had taken control of Ashwick Hollow 10 years ago after it had been shut down due to numerous allegations of animal abuse. The ranch, once a beacon of wealth and prestige, had been reduced to nothing more than a tarnished reputation. Foals had gone missing, employees had disappeared, and the place had been sold off to the highest bidder. That bidder had been none other than Callahan. Reese sat back in his chair, staring at the files laid out in front of him. His mind raced. The Colt, the burned, bloodied animal he'd found on the side of the road, was tied to this estate. The brand, the injuries. It all pointed to Ashwick Hollow, and Sterling Callahan was the key to everything. The thought made Reese uneasy. Callahan was a powerful man, untouchable almost. His wealth had bought him influence, and his influence had kept Ashwick Hollow's darker secrets buried. But the more Reese thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't let that stop him. He wasn't going to let a billionaire's money and power bury the truth any longer. The Colt was his chance to expose it all. The drive to Ashwick Hollow took longer than expected. The road twisted and turned, the landscape growing more desolate as Reese neared the estate. The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the wake of its scandal. The mansion itself loomed in the distance, a crumbling reminder of the wealth that once resided there. The once beautiful ranch had been reduced to ashes, not literally, but in every other sense. Reese pulled his truck to a stop near the entrance of the estate, the iron gates now rusted and locked. He stepped out of the truck and took a long look at the mansion in the distance. It seemed almost haunted, as if the land itself had absorbed the lies and the pain that had been inflicted here. The property had been shuttered, but the ghosts of its past were very much alive. He walked toward the entrance, the ground beneath his boots uneven and cracked. The air was thick with the scent of decay, an oppressive heaviness that weighed on him as he made his way toward the old weathered stables. It was there that Reese felt the full weight of Ashwick Hollow's tragic history. The place was nothing like the luxurious estate it had once been. Now it was little more than a forgotten ruin. As he entered the stables, Reese's eyes adjusted to the dim light that filtered in through the cracks in the walls. The stables were empty, save for the remnants of old equipment, broken fences, and rotting hay bales. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that only comes from long-abandoned places. But Reese wasn't here for the silence. He was here for the truth. He moved through the stables with purpose, inspecting every corner, every stall, every piece of equipment. There were signs of neglect everywhere. The place had been left to fall apart, just like the reputation of Ashwick Hollow itself. But as Reese reached the farthest stall, something caught his eye. A faint outline of a symbol burned into the wooden wall. It was the same brand that had been on the Colt side. A simple yet distinctive symbol, the same one that had been buried beneath the Colt's fur, erased by the fire. Reese's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just an abandoned ranch. It was a graveyard for the truth. And here, in the shadows of these broken walls, was the evidence he needed to expose it all. He took out his phone and snapped a picture of the brand. As he did, his mind raced. The missing foals, the abuse allegations, the fire that had destroyed the ranch's reputation. Everything was connected. Sterling Callahan had been the mastermind behind it all, and the Colt was the key to unlocking his empire of lies. Reese didn't waste any time. He headed back to the truck, the image of the brand still fresh in his mind. There was no going back now. He had to confront Callahan. He had to make him answer for the things he had done. And he had to do it before the man realized what Reese had uncovered. Just as he was about to get in his truck, Reese froze. A sound, a rustling in the distance. Someone, or something, was moving nearby. His hand instinctively went to his side, where his service pistol rested in its holster. He scanned the area, his eyes darting across the empty fields, but all he saw was the dilapidated barn, the crumbling fences, and the wind sweeping across the desolate land. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered the sense of danger creeping up on him. Reese didn't take any chances. He slid into his truck, started the engine, and drove off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The deeper he dug into Ashwick Hollow, the more he realized that there were people out there. Dangerous people. Oh yeah, who would do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. And he was going to make sure they didn't get away with it. Marshall Reese barely made it out of Ashwick Hollow before the sense of unease settled deep within his gut. The feeling of being watched had only intensified as he left the dilapidated ranch behind, but he had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming at him. Someone was watching him. Someone was aware of what he was doing. And it wasn't just any someone. It was someone who had vested interest in making sure he didn't get too close to the truth. Reese didn't drive directly home. Instead, he headed toward the small diner on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet place, the kind where everyone knew everyone else. And gossip was the currency of choice. He needed a moment to think, to sort through everything he'd uncovered. But most of all, he needed to figure out his next move. The picture of the brand, the connection to Ashwick Hollow, the Colt, it was all becoming clearer. But it was still a tangled web of secrets and lies that he wasn't sure he could unravel on his own. The diner's bell jingled as he pushed the door open, and the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee hit him. The place was mostly empty, save for a few regulars hunched over their mugs, talking in low voices. Reese took a seat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and sat in silence, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't been there long when the door opened again, and a man walked in. A tall figure, wearing a long coat, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. He moved with an air of quiet confidence, his steps deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Reese instinctively tensed. There was something about the man that didn't sit right, the way he carried himself, the coldness in his eyes, the way he scanned the room like he was searching for someone. The man's gaze landed on Reese almost immediately. Without a word, he made his way to the counter and sat down beside him. Reese didn't flinch, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This was no coincidence. The man ordered a coffee, his voice low, and then turned to Reese. His eyes were sharp, calculating, like a predator assessing its prey. "You're the detective, right?" the man asked, his tone flat, but with an edge that suggested he already knew the answer. "Marshall Reese." Reese looked at him for a moment, studying him closely. He didn't answer right away, not sure how much he should reveal. But there was something in the man's gaze, something that made Reese feel like he wasn't in control of the situation. "I am," Reese said, carefully, keeping his voice steady. The man nodded, as if this was the confirmation he had been waiting for. "I think you have something of mine?" Reese raised an eyebrow. The words caught him off guard. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "I think you do. The Colt. The one you found in the road last night. I'm here to take him back." Reese's pulse quickened. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real. The man in front of him, he wasn't just some concerned animal lover. He was connected to the Colt, and from the way he spoke, he thought he had a right to it. "Who are you?" Reese asked, his voice cold now. His instincts were telling him this man wasn't just a handler or a ranch hand. He was something else entirely. The man paused, taking a slow sip from his coffee, never breaking eye contact. "Name's Emmett Radner," he said finally. "I'm the Colt's rightful handler. He belongs to me." Reese's mind raced. This was the man who had shown up at the scene last night, the one who had demanded the Colt. But something about his story didn't add up. The Colt was clearly tied to Ashwick Hollow, a place with a history of abuse. And this man, Emmett Radner, was connected to it somehow. But in what way? "I don't know who you think you are," Reese said, his tone sharp, but that Colt was in bad shape when I found him. I'm not just going to hand him over to anyone. Radnor's gaze never wavered. I didn't ask you to, he said evenly. I'm just, telling you what's mine. You can keep him, for now. But don't think for a second that you're in control of this situation. Reese studied him, trying to read the man's intentions, but he was like a stone, impassive, unreadable. It was clear that Radnor wasn't just interested in the Colt for sentimental reasons. There was something more at play here, something darker. You're not telling me everything, Reese said, his voice low. What's really going on with that Colt? Radnor leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't want to know, he said, his tone almost too calm, too smooth. You're in over your head. The Colt isn't just some stray animal. It's tied to something bigger, and if you keep pushing, you'll find yourself in the middle of a war you can't win. Reese's gut tightened. He'd known there was more to this, but hearing it from Radnor confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just about an abused horse. It was about a cover-up, a $1 billion conspiracy that stretched far beyond the ranches of Verdon Falls. And what's your role in all this? Reese asked, leaning forward slightly. What's your stake in this war? Radnor's smile was cold, calculated. Let's just say I'm on the winning side. And you, he said, his eyes narrowing, you're making a mistake getting involved. I suggest you walk away before it's too late. Reese felt a surge of anger but held it back, knowing that getting emotional would only play into Radnor's hands. And the man was trying to intimidate him, to make him back off, but Reese wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when he was this close to the truth. I'm not going anywhere, Reese said firmly, and I'm not handing over the Colt. Radnor's gaze flickered for a moment, but then he gave a small nod, as though he had expected this answer. Then you've sealed your fate, he said quietly, and when the time comes, you'll understand just how far you've gone down the rabbit hole. Oh, with that, Radnor stood up, leaving a tip on the counter before turning and walking out of the diner without another word. Reese watched him go, his mind racing. There was more to Emmett Radnor than he was letting on. And whatever game he was playing, Reese was now firmly in the middle of it. Reese sat in his truck for a long while, after Emmett Radnor left the diner, the man's warning echoing in his mind. You'll understand just how far you've gone down the rabbit hole. Those words kept turning over and over in his head, each repetition adding more weight to the already heavy burden of uncertainty that pressed on his chest. He wasn't naive enough to believe that this was just about a burnt Colt on the side of the road. This had grown into something far bigger, and the more he uncovered, the darker it became. It was late afternoon, before Reese returned to his barn. The Colt was resting in the stall, its shallow breathing steady now, but still fragile. The animal's pain was far from over. Neither was his own. The weight of everything Reese had learned from the previous day, from the ranch to Emmett's ominous words, settled on him with a slow, grinding pressure. Ashwick Hollow, the ranch that had once been the pride of this area, wasn't just a relic of a bygone era. It was a ticking time bomb of secrets. And somehow, the Colt was at the center of it all. Reese knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone who could help him navigate this. Someone with expertise in what was happening behind the scenes of these multi-million-dollar operations, and he knew exactly where to turn. His phone buzzed on the front seat of the truck, pulling Reese from his thoughts. It was a message from Arya. Got some new info? Meet me tonight. Same place? Come alone. Reese didn't hesitate. If Arya had found something, he needed to hear it. He wasn't sure what had been uncovered, but he knew it would bring him closer to the truth. It had to. Underscore, 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 underscore. The small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town was quiet at this hour. Reese arrived early, ready on edge, his mind reeling from the conversation with Radnor. The cafe's lone bartender glanced up as he entered, but no one paid much attention to him, except for Arya, sitting at a corner booth with a laptop open in front of her. Reese made his way to the booth, sliding into the seat across from her. Arya's expression was more serious than he had ever seen it, her brows furrowed in concentration as she glanced at him before, tapping a few keys on her laptop. "Glad you made it," Arya said quietly, her voice tight with urgency. "I've been digging into Ashwick Hollow, trying to connect the dots. And what I found? It's worse than I thought." Reese leaned forward, his voice low. "What are we talking about?" "Here. You said you had new information." Arya glanced around, ensuring no one was paying attention, then slid the laptop closer to Reese. "The Colt's bloodline. The brand on its side. It's not just any random symbol. It belongs to a very specific line of horses bred at Ashwick Hollow, and these horses were sold off in the late 90s to private buyers, mostly wealthy individuals looking to invest in elite racehorses. Some of those buyers, they're still around, and they're connected to Sterling Callahan." Reese narrowed his eyes, processing the information. "So, this Colt's bloodline could change everything. If it's proven, it could give someone a claim over the property?" "Exactly," Arya replied. "The thing is, these horses weren't just sold, they were disappeared. The missing foals, the ones no one could track down, some of them were shipped off under false pretenses, sold in underground auctions to the highest bidder. But now, with this Colt, the bloodline can be traced back to Ashwick Hollow, and if someone makes that connection, it's over for Callahan. The entire property, the empire he's built on that land, could crumble." Reese absorbed the weight of her words. The stakes were much higher than he had anticipated. If the Colt's bloodline was confirmed, it could destroy everything Callahan had worked for, the ranch, his reputation, and possibly even his fortune. No wonder someone like Emmett Radner was willing to go to such lengths to reclaim the Colt. But why would Callahan want to erase all this? Reese asked. "Why not just let the horses be?" Arya leaned back in her chair, glancing around before speaking again. "It's not just about the horses. It's about control. Ashwick Hollow wasn't just a ranch. It was a breeding ground for wealth and influence. The horses bred there weren't just prized for their speed, they were prized for their potential to produce more champions. And Callahan, with all his money, wasn't just buying a ranch. He was buying an empire, a legacy, and a bloodline that could be traced back to something far more powerful than, he wanted anyone to know." Reese felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected that this whole thing had more layers to it than anyone could have guessed, but hearing it so plainly laid out, it was like a bomb had just gone off in his mind. If Callahan's empire was based on this bloodline, then it wasn't just about horses. It was about control of something much larger. And if the Colt was the key to unseating that empire, Reese knew there was no going back. He glanced up at Arya, determination flickering in his eyes. "So, what do we do now?" Arya hesitated for a moment, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her laptop. "We need evidence. We need to prove the Colt's bloodline and make it public. But we also need to be careful. Callahan won't stop until he's silenced everyone involved." Reese nodded. "Then we find the proof, and we make sure it's seen." Before Arya could respond, her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen, her face draining of color. She slid the phone across the table to read. It was a text from an unknown number, but it was clear who it was from. "You're digging in places you shouldn't. I told you to walk away. You've crossed a line. Last warning." Reese's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. "We don't have much time, Arya. We're in this now, and there's no turning back." It was a cold night when the fire came. Marshal Reese had barely finished his dinner when the first sign of trouble came, a sharp crackle followed by a series of muffled pops in the distance. He was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the notes Arya had passed him earlier, when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of flames licking the air. His heart sank as he rushed to the window and looked out into the darkened sky. A faint orange glow was visible through the eosphore of the trees, barely noticeable but growing stronger by the second. The barn. The Colt. Without thinking, Reese grabbed his coat and ran for the door, his boots hitting the cold ground with urgency. He had known this day would come, but nothing could prepare him for the sight that awaited him outside. The flames were already reaching into the night, curling upward from the direction of the barn, which was now fully engulfed in fire. The heat of it hit him even from a distance, sending a wave of panic rushing through him. The barn, the place where he had cared for the Colt, where he had begun to unravel the tangled web of lies surrounding Ashwick Hollow, was burning to the ground. His mind raced as he sprinted toward the barn. Every step felt like it could be his last. He had known they were after him, but he never imagined it would come to this. They had set the fire to silence him, to destroy everything he had worked for. Reese didn't know who had done it, whether it was Callahan's men or Radnor or someone else, but the message was clear. He was getting too close. As he neared the barn, he could hear the roar of the flames, the crackling and snapping of wood as the structure buckled under the weight of the fire. His eyes stung from the thick smoke, but he didn't stop. He had to save the Colt. It was the only thing that mattered now. When he reached the barn, the heat was unbearable. The flames had completely engulfed the roof, sending sparks and embers into the air. Reese didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby bucket of water and threw it on the nearest part of the fire, but it was useless. The flames spread too fast, their hunger too powerful. The barn was a death trap, and the Colt, he needed to get to the Colt before it was too late. "Phoenix!" Reese yelled, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He stumbled through the barn's open door, choking on the acrid air. His eyes stung, but he pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Phoenix, where are you?" He heard a faint whimper in the distance. The Colt was still alive. Reese moved quickly, his boots sliding on the wet floor as he pushed through the smoke-filled barn, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found the Colt at the far end, standing near the wall, its eyes wide with fear. Its body was covered in soot and ash, and it seemed disoriented, struggling to breathe in the thick smoke. Reese didn't waste a second. He grabbed the Colt by the reins and led it toward the door, ignoring the heat that was becoming unbearable. As he pulled the Colt toward the exit, he stumbled. His foot caught on a broken beam, and he fell to the ground, the Colt jerking to a stop beside him. The fire was closing in, its heat suffocating, but Reese wasn't about to leave the Colt behind. He gritted his teeth, pulled himself up, and managed to drag the animal out of the barn, his hands burning from the heat. The moment they crossed the threshold of the barn, Reese collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The Colt, too, seemed to be struggling, its legs shaky and weak. The fire behind them roared, sending plumes of smoke into the night sky. The barn was beyond saving. Nothing could be done now, but they had made it out. They were alive. As Reese looked up at the inferno in the distance, the sounds of the fire filled his ears. Crackling, snapping, the flames' hungry roar drowning out everything else. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but his mind felt numb, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. The fire had come for him, no doubt about it, but the ray had survived. For now. From the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow moving toward him. Reese's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if it was Callahan's men or someone else, but he wasn't about to take any chances. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but when he saw who it was, his heart stopped. Emmett Radnor. The man appeared out of the darkness, his figure outlined by the flickering flames behind him. He was standing in the distance, his eyes glinting in the firelight as he watched Reese and the Colt. There was no surprise in his face, just cold, calculating indifference. Radnor hadn't come to help. He had come to make sure they didn't escape. I told you not to get involved, Radnor said, his voice calm, even though the fire was roaring behind him. But you wouldn't listen, would you? Reese stood up, his body still trembling from the exertion of dragging the Colt to safety. He didn't have time for Radnor's games. Not now. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. I don't know what your game is, Radnor, but I'm done playing by your rules. I'm going to find out what happened at Ashwick Hollow, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. This fire, this is just the beginning. You won't get away with it. Radnor's smile remained unwavering, his expression unfazed by Reese's anger. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about you. It's about something much bigger than you or me, and if you keep pushing, you'll learn just how far this goes, just like Ashwick Hollow did. With that, Radnor turned, disappearing into the shadows of the night, leaving Reese with nothing but the sound of the fire and the weight of his words. Reese stood there, his mind spinning, the Colt still trembling beside him. He had escaped the fire, but the war had only just begun. The dawn came, casting pale light across the smoldering remnants of Reese's barn. The fire had left its mark, transforming the place he had once considered a sanctuary into a twisted memorial of what was at stake. The night before had been a close call, but in the end, Reedy de Solis had managed to pull the Colt to safety. Phoenix, he had named the Colt in honor of the creature's fiery spirit, was still alive, though shaken, its once proud head now lowered in exhaustion. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Reese knew that the next step was already upon him. He didn't hesitate. As soon as the sun had fully risen, he put the Colt into the back of his truck, securing it with care, and started the engine. It was time to return to Ashwick Hollow. The estate loomed in the distance as he neared. The dilapidated gates still hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The place had always felt like a ghost town, an old relic of something that was meant to die. The fire had ravaged it years ago, leaving behind a hollow shell of what had once been. Yet, despite the desolation, there was something menacing about the place, something that told Reese that no matter how much had crumbled, Ashwick Hollow still held secrets that had yet to be exposed. Reese knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed answers, and for that, he would have to dig deeper into the ranch's ruins. There were documents, records, something that could prove the Colt's true bloodline and shed light on just how far Callahan was willing to go to bury the past. If the Colt's ancestry could be traced back to Ashwick Hollow's prized lineage, it could bring down Callahan's entire empire. That was the goal. But the more Reese thought about it, the more he realized that every step forward brought him closer to the storm. He wasn't just uncovering the truth anymore. He was putting a target on his back. The truck bumped over the uneven road, and Reese's gaze never wavered from the looming mansion ahead. When he finally reached the old ranch, the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was too quiet, even for an abandoned estate. The wind howled through the broken windows, the remnants of a once grand home now only a shadow of its former self. Reese could feel the weight of the place pressing in on him, each step closer to the mansion feeling like an ominous countdown. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. He wasn't alone here, not by a long shot. He parked the truck near the stable, the same spot where he had first seen the Colt. The barn was no longer standing, its skeleton reduced to a pile of charred timber, but the air still carried the scent of burning wood. Reese's boots crunched against the ground as he moved quickly, checking the perimeter for any signs of movement. He wasn't foolish enough to think that Callahan's men had forgotten about him. This place had been under surveillance for too long to assume that they'd missed him. Reese carefully unloaded Phoenix from the truck, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The Colt was still skittish from the fire, but it was stronger now, standing tall on its own four legs, ready to face whatever came next. Reese ran his hand down the Colt's side, reassuring it without words, and led it toward the ruins of the old ranch house. His heart raced as he made his way through the remains of Ashwick Hollow. It was hard to imagine that this had once been a thriving ranch. Now it felt like a tomb, the walls crumbling, the air thick with dust and decay. But this was no time for nostalgia. Reese had a job to do, and the answers he needed were here, hidden somewhere in the rubble. He moved methodically through the ruins, stepping over broken furniture and collapsed beams. Every now and then, he would pause, his eyes scanning the wreckage for something useful. There had to be something, some shred of evidence, that would prove the Colt's rightful place in the bloodline of Ashwick Hollow. It was when he reached the old office that he found it. The door had fallen off its hinges, but the room was still relatively intact, protected from the worst of the fire by the thick stone walls. Reese stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the desk at the far corner. Papers were strewn about, half burned and discolored by time, but there, half buried beneath the ash, was a leather-bound registry. His pulse quickened as he reached for it, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. There it was. The brand. The same one he had seen on the Colt. It was listed in the registry under the name of one of Ashwick Hollow's finest mares, an elite line of thoroughbreds. And the Colt? The Colt was the direct descendant, the proof that this line had never truly been erased. Reese's heart raced as he looked over the document, the implications of what he was holding starting to sink in. This wasn't just about a single Colt. It was about everything Ashwick Hollow had stood for: the wealth, the power, the control. But before Reese could absorb the full weight of the discovery, he heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Reese's heart stopped. He wasn't alone. Someone was coming. He grabbed the registry and stuffed it into his coat before turning to the door. His mind raced. He had to get out. He had the proof. The proof that could bring Callahan down. But he wasn't going to be able to make it out of here without a fight. As he moved toward the back door, he saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway of the barn. Reese's heart skipped a beat. It was Emmett Radnor. "I told you," Radnor said, his voice low and dangerous, "that you should have stayed away." Reese didn't have time for words. He turned, heading for the woods behind the ranch, hoping to lose Radnor in the thick brush. But as he moved, he heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot ringing out through the air. The bullet whizzed past him, narrowly missing. Reese's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With the registry hidden safely in his coat and the Colt at his side, Reese broke into a sprint, the adrenaline fueling him as he ran toward the safety of the trees. He didn't know how far he would make it, but he knew one thing. He had to keep running. The truth was finally within his grasp, but he wasn't the only one chasing it. The woods were thick, the trees a dark blur around Reese as he ran, his feet pounding against the wet ground. Phoenix, though exhausted from the fire, was still with him, its hooves clattering along the dirt path as it followed close behind. Reese could hear the sounds of pursuit, footsteps, voices, the occasional bark of a dog. But he didn't dare look back. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. Not now, not when he was so close. The registry was still tucked into his coat. A beacon of truth that could topple Sterling Callahan's empire. But it wasn't just about the evidence anymore. It was about survival. Reese had seen firsthand what people like Callahan were capable of, what they would do to protect their wealth and power. And now, Callahan's men were hot on his heels, determined to stop him before he could expose the truth. Phoenix stumbled briefly, its body still weak from the fire, but Reese urged it on, his voice low and comforting. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his hand on the Colt's side. "We're almost there." He pushed through the underbrush, sweat streaming down his face as he dodged branches and brambles. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they closed in on him. Reese had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a manhunt, it was a race against time. The moment he stopped running, everything would be over. But then, as if the heavens themselves had decided to intervene, Phoenix let out a sharp, desperate whinny. Reese froze, his heart skipping a beat. The Colt had stopped, its legs planted firmly on the ground, its body tense with fear. "Phoenix," Reese called out, panic creeping into his voice. He took a cautious step forward, but the Colt remained frozen, its eyes wide with terror. And then, Reese heard it too, the faint sound of footsteps approaching, fast and purposeful. They were close, too close. His mind raced. He couldn't run with Phoenix if the Colt was too frightened to move. They were trapped, cornered in the woods with no way out. But then, in a moment of clarity, Reese remembered something that had kept him alive in situations just like this one. It was the Colt's instinct. Reese had seen it before. Phoenix wasn't just any horse. The Colt had a fire in its heart, a spirit that couldn't be broken, and now, Reese would have to trust that spirit to get them out of this alive. "Phoenix," he called softly, his voice steady despite the growing pressure. "I need you now more than ever. Trust me. We're in this together." For a brief moment, the Colt stood still, its eyes locked on Reese's. Then, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, Phoenix snorted and stamped its hooves, readying itself to move. The Colt's body relaxed, and with a sudden burst of energy, it bolted forward, its hooves tearing through the underbrush. Reese didn't hesitate. He leaped onto Phoenix's back, gripping the reins tightly as the Colt sprinted through the woods, faster than Reese had ever seen it move. The trees blurred around them, the wind rushing past his face. But Reese kept his focus. The Colt was their only chance now. They had to make it out of these woods before Callahan's men could catch up. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they sped through the forest, but Reese knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, a way to escape before the hunters caught up with them. And then, as if by fate, Reese spotted it, an old wooden fence on the edge of the woods, barely visible through the thick trees. It was a boundary line, a break in the forest that led to open land. "That's our way out," Reese muttered to himself, urging Phoenix forward. The Colt's muscles rippled beneath him, its breathing steady but quick. They were getting closer, but then, from the corner of his eye, Reese saw something that made his heart race. Another figure, moving swiftly through the woods. A man. It was Emmett Radnor. Radnor wasn't far behind. Reese could hear his footsteps now, the faint rustling of leaves as Radnor closed the distance. He had underestimated how quickly Radnor could move. But now the hunter had become the hunted. Phoenix pushed forward, faster than Reese thought possible. The Colt's eyes narrowed in determination. Reese's pulse quickened as they neared the fence. There was no time to stop, no time to think. They had to leap the fence, or they would be trapped in the woods with Radnor and his men closing in. With one last push, Phoenix leaped, its hooves clearing the fence in one smooth motion. Reese felt the momentary weightlessness as the Colt soared over the wooden barrier, landing gracefully on the other side. But the moment they hit the ground, Reese knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. They were now in open land, but they still had a long way to go. Radnor's men were relentless, and Reese wasn't naive enough to think they were safe just because they had crossed the fence. The Colt was strong, but it couldn't outrun a well-armed man on foot. Not for long. And then, just as Reese was about to push Phoenix for more speed, something unexpected happened. The Colt veered sharply to the side, charging straight toward Radnor, who had appeared just beyond the fence, blocking their path. "Phoenix! No!" Reese shouted, but it was too late. The Colt had already closed the distance, its hooves pounding the earth with terrifying speed. Radnor barely had time to react before Phoenix collided with him, the Colt's body knocking him off his feet, sending him tumbling to the ground. The impact stunned Radnor, and for a moment he lay still, caught off guard. Reese's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He kicked Phoenix's sides, urging the Colt to keep moving to get them both out of danger. As Radnor scrambled to his feet, Reese could see the anger in his eyes, but there was no time to savor the small victory. Phoenix had given them just enough time, but now they had to keep running. The truth was still out there, and they couldn't let Radnor, or anyone else, stop them now. With one final glance over his shoulder, Reese and Phoenix rode into the night, the Colt's courage leading the way. The days that followed the harrowing escape from Ashwick Hollow felt like an endless blur to Marshal Reese. He and Phoenix had managed to slip past Radnor and Callahan's men, making their way across fields and through forests until they reached the relative safety of an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Verdon Falls. The place wasn't much: a roof, 4 walls, and a few sturdy rooms, but it was a sanctuary. For the first time in days, Reese felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had the evidence. He had the truth. Now, he just had to make sure it didn't get buried. Phoenix had quickly become the symbol of everything Reese had fought for: freedom, justice, and the strength to face what had seemed insurmountable. The Colt's bloodline, tied directly to the once renowned Ashwick Hollow, was no longer just a piece of history. It was the key to unraveling a corrupt dynasty that had plagued this land for too long. And now, the truth was finally within reach. With the registry safely hidden away, Reese knew it was time to make his next move. But before that, he needed to protect Phoenix. The Colt had become the target of so many dangerous people that Reese couldn't risk leaving it exposed. Not when so much was at stake. He had already seen what Callahan and his men were willing to do to protect their empire. Reese had always considered himself a solitary man. He had never been the type to trust easily. But as he sat on the porch of the farmhouse, looking out over the rolling hills with Phoenix by his side, he couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. A chance to right the wrongs that had plagued the land for so long. The first step was to go public. He couldn't do it alone. He needed to bring in allies who could help him expose the truth. And for that, he called on Arya. She had been his anchor through this entire ordeal, and he trusted her more than anyone else. Arya arrived at the farmhouse late one evening, her truck kicking up dust as she pulled into the driveway. Reese greeted her outside, and there was a moment of silence between them, a shared understanding that everything had changed. The stakes had never been higher. "I got the proof," Reese said, his voice low but steady. He pulled the leather-bound registry from his jacket and handed it to Arya. She took it in her hands, her expression serious as she flipped through the pages, confirming everything they had suspected. This is it," she murmured, her fingers brushing over the names and the symbols that linked the Colt to Ashwick Hollow's lost bloodline. "With this, we can expose Callahan for what he is. But we're going to need more. We need a platform. We need the media. We need to make sure the world sees what he's done." Reese nodded. "I know. That's why I called you. I can't do this alone. We need to make sure the truth gets out before Callahan has a chance to bury it." Arya stood up, her eyes flashing with determination. "We'll get the word out, Reese. It's time to bring this all to light." They didn't waste any time. The next few days were spent making calls, gathering information, and reaching out to trusted journalists and animal rights groups who could help them spread the word. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Callahan had too much power, too many connections, but Reese was no stranger to fighting uphill battles. This was just another one to add to the list. As the story gained traction, the pressure mounted. News outlets picked it up, and soon the once forgotten Ashwick Hollow was back in the public eye. Not as a symbol of wealth and prestige, but as a place of lies, abuse, and exploitation. Reese watched as the walls of Callahan's empire began to crack. The media reports, the investigations into the ranch's shady dealings, and the outcry from animal rights organizations put Callahan on the defensive. But it wasn't just the media. Legal investigations were launched, and soon Callahan found himself facing a storm of lawsuits and public backlash that he couldn't ignore. Reese kept his distance from the public eye, unwilling to let his name be part of the circus. His job wasn't to be a hero or a martyr. His job was to make sure the truth came out and that it would stick. But even as the world began to take notice of Ashwick Hollow's dark past, Reese couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. One afternoon, as Reese was sitting around in the barn, tending to Phoenix, he heard a truck pull up outside. He wasn't expecting anyone. His hand instinctively reached for the gun tucked beneath his coat, but then he saw her, the sheriff. Sheriff Lena Carver, an old friend from his time in the force. "I heard about what you did," Sheriff Carver said, her voice warm but firm. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Reese. Callahan's people are scrambling. But you've also given a lot of people hope. Reese didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, looking at Phoenix, who stood nearby, its head high, eyes calm despite the storm of events that had unfolded. Reese knew that what they had done would change things. It had to. But there was still so much work left to be done. Sheriff Carver took a seat on the porch, gazing out at the land. "What now?" she asked quietly. Reese took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Now we finish what we started," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "We make sure Callahan's legacy is torn down, piece by piece, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As the days turned into weeks, the legal battle for Ashwick Hollow raged on. Callahan's empire was slowly crumbling, his influence slipping through his fingers like sand, but even as the media frenzy continued, Reese found solace in the small victories. The Colt, the one that had started it all, was no longer just a victim of cruelty. It was a symbol of something much larger: resilience, truth, and the power of one voice to bring down a dynasty built on lies. Phoenix, now free from the clutches of Ashwick Hollow's dark history, ran through the fields with Reese by its side. It was a new beginning, a new legacy. Reese had set out to save one Colt, but in doing so, he had torn down a wall that had kept the truth hidden for far too long. And in the end, he realized that the Colt wasn't just a lost soul. It was the crack in the wall that had allowed the truth to run free. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One honest man and one courageous Colt to bring about change.